Well, a very good evening to you and a very warm welcome to the fifth in our series, The Quality of Mercy. Tonight, the quality of mercy in drama. I'm very privileged to introduce to you Simon Russell Beale, Juliet, Stevenson and Richard Carter, all of whom, for different reasons, need no further introduction. The way it's going to work is that Juliet's about to read to us a passage that I hope by this stage through will be familiar to you from the Merchant of Venice. And then I'm going to talk about that passage and other such passages with Simon for a little while. Then Simon's going to read us a passage from King Lear, and I'm going to talk to Juliet for a little while, and then I'm going to talk to Richard for a little while, and I'm going to talk to all of them for a little while. And then if there's any time left, we're going to talk to you guys for a little bit. And then we'll go downstairs and talk about what we've talked about. So, Juliet, can I ask you to come to probably here and read to us?
The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives, and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His sceptre shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself, and earthly power doth then show likest God's when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy.
Thank you. Simon, if I could ask you to come to this middle microphone.
Feels very formal.
And tell us, you've played almost every part in the theatre in your time. Does any of them stand out for you as portraying mercy in a significant way?
It's fascinating listening to that passage that Juliet read. My immediate answer when you ask me that question, my immediate thought is about The Tempest, which was one of the last Shakespeare plays I've done. And I have to talk about Shakespeare, I apologise. But he became very exercised, I think, in the latter part of his writing career about forgiveness and about sorting things out. Whether it was because he was coming to the end of his life and knew it, I don't know. Anyway, The Tempest is one of the last plays he wrote, his last solo author play, and Prospero, the central magician in the story, forgives his brother, and his brother doesn't respond. It's a play that The Tempest was written just after The Winter's Tale, where somebody, I think, is forgiven by somebody they've hurt, although people debate that as well. But in The Tempest, it seems to be absolutely clear that Prospero high-handedly offers mercy and is turned down by the person being offered it. And I think that what Shakespeare was doing was going a little step further than we anticipate about resolution. And I think was trying, and if he'd written more plays of that type, I think he would have pushed the argument even further. Because the interesting thing about that Merchant of Venice speech is, of course, it's all about kings. And mercy drops from heaven on the place beneath. Mercy is seen as an attribute that's higher and better than the crown that kings wear. In other words, it's a very high status position to hold, to offer mercy. And what if the person being offered mercy doesn't want it? And that's the closest I've got to an offer of mercy that I've had to play on stage. It's interesting, it blesses him that gives and him that receives.
Him that gives and him that
Takes. Yeah, you see, I think Shakespeare was wondering whether that was entirely true by that stage. But then I think we have to define what mercy is anyway. I'm sure you've been doing it over the last weeks before Juliet and I arrived. But whether it is a high status thing to do, whether it's the same as forgiveness, compassion, empathy, or whether those are different things, whether mercy is a very particular type of process.
Well, that is actually something we've stumbled over quite a bit in previous weeks, because several of our speakers have pushed back against the assumption that the person in power, the high status person as you describe it, is always the person to bestow mercy, because the weak person is always the sinner. And they've pointed out, as is much more common these days than once was the case, that actually it's more often than not the other way round, that in a, if you like, a post-colonial context, it's the country that's been invaded, that has been manipulated and been exploited, that is now being asked for mercy towards the former imperial, but possibly neo-imperial power. It's a different dynamic. Could you say something about how that reverses?
Forgive me for sticking with Shakespeare. I will talk about other playwrights as well, but forgive me for sticking with Shakespeare for the moment. The characters in his plays, very often the comedies, but the early tragedies, who are high status, very often are figures of justice. Perhaps even mercy, but Prince of Verona at the end of Romeo and Juliet, those sort of people who come on at the end of the play and go, right, that's all sorted out, the issue has been resolved, and here we go again. In other words, a slightly conservative with a small c, which is why Shakespeare is accused of this very often, of being a conservative writer, that he likes the status quo is to be trusted, justice will be done. Of course, actually, that's not entirely true of his work, in the sense that the main central, big, complex characters at the centre of his plays, in the tragedies especially, are men, usually men, in power, who abuse that power. So he's perfectly willing to discuss that process of powerful men abusing power. It's something that he's very interested in. So I don't think it's an easily defined picture about status and mercy in Shakespeare's mind, anyway. Talking about the colonial question, I mean, Tempest, again, is the play that seems to address that most, directly for Shakespeare, obliquely for the rest of the world, but directly for Shakespeare in Caliban and his relationship with Prospero, which, again, is something that is very difficult to chart in terms of mercy. And accepting forgiveness and accepting on Prospero, or giving forgiveness on Caliban's part to Prospero. So I mean, he does debate these issues, but he doesn't necessarily resolve them, as we know.
Could you talk then about either a part that you've played that's been in the low status position, or another actor you've seen play a part, or another person in a play where you've been in the high status role who's conveyed that quality of mercy from the underside, from the person who has been profoundly not just wronged but abused and oppressed? Could you
can I answer that slightly tangentially by saying something I've been exercised by recently a lot in terms of these great literary texts is beauty in Shakespeare, which is very often used in situations which almost fool you out of making the obvious judgment on the characters. An actor's part, a job, is partly judgment. We're always trained to have absolute sympathy for our parts. That is absolutely correct insofar as it goes. But you you do instinctively, I think, judge the part you're playing or the behaviour of the part you're playing. So, for instance, if you're playing Othello and you have some of the most beautiful verse ever written at the end of that play, but you're doing it over the corpse of the woman you've killed, what does that do to the audience? How does it seduce the audience? If you're playing King Lear, which I did a couple of years ago, and you have a speech of such iridescent beauty to your daughter saying we should live together, now we're reconciled, we should live together in a prison, and we're like birds in a cage and we'll have a lovely time, and you're thinking, you're absolutely bonkers. What you're actually saying to your newly married young daughter who you've abused a couple of hours ago in the play's time, you're saying we should live together in a prison. And I think there's a very famous scene in Titus Andronicus, which many of you will know, an early Shakespeare play where Lavinia, Titus's daughter, is raped, has her hands cut off and her tongue ripped out. She comes on stage and her uncle, Marcus, sees her and delivers a speech 30 lines long. It used to be cut. Deborah Warner famously reintroduced it to everybody's astonishment, in which he delicately traces, in the most exquisite language, I don't even know it's beautiful, it's Ovidian, exquisite language, traces his reaction to her mutilation. And most people find that almost impossible to reconcile. But there is a way of doing that as an actor, which I saw when Deborah did it, which is that it becomes an expression of love and care. Am I making sense here? There are ways round coping with beauty in horrific situations on stage. And is that hypocritical? I don't know.
Yeah. Were Shakespeare alive today and writing a tragedy, perhaps, about a contemporary story which involved the quality of mercy?
Oh, there's only one story he'd write about, wouldn't it? I mean, we're having a history play written in front of us, aren't we? I mean, the sheer glee he would have in writing about the power politics of Brexit, I'm sorry to mention it, but it would be irresistible to him, I think. I mean, partly because there is that awful grotesque comedy about the whole process that he would have enjoyed, and which he showed in the history plays that he wrote himself. But he would have loved the power politics of that. Whether he would have, the other great issues like climate change or our relationship with the internet and the general elections coming up, I wonder whether he would have done a more elliptical approach. He always tended to do an elliptical approach. I think he would have honed in on Brexit, probably.
And who needs to be merciful to whom?
Who needs to be merciful to Shakespeare?
No, who needs to be merciful to whom in the Brexit story?
I think the list is endless. I mean, the other person...
Would it be Brexit the 8th, part 1, part Brexit the 4th,
part 1,
part
2, 3, 4, 5, yeah. It is interesting because now the thing about defining mercy as opposed to empathy or compassion. The other person who the other great playwright that I've done a lot of is Chekhov, of course, and Chekhov is a merciful writer in his very bones. But whether I'm confusing mercy with sympathy, I don't know. But that is that he is the most merciful writer I have ever played. And when you ask that question, the first thought about a performance that I've seen was the greatest piece of acting I've ever seen on stage, which was Paul Schofield in John Gabriel Borkman playing a man who has just come out of prison for fraud, and estranged from his wife, estranged from his whole family, actually, and it's pretty unattractive all the way through. And then the last bit of the play, Ibsen gives him a moment of absolute transcendence, and this is again the beauty question. He gives him a speech about he's a miner. I think he's a miner. I'm not quite sure what he does, but he does something with this character, with the earth. And he has an extraordinary sequence, and he dies in the snow outside, doing this paean, this eulogy to the beauties of the earth, which he is going to dig up and use. And it's about power, and but it's beautiful to listen to. So that's actually the first thought that came into my head. But again, is it a moral sleight of hand? I don't know.
Well, I'm going to ask you now to read that passage from King Lear, if I may. Because you've been very serious, you've actually pushed the lectern to the edge of the stage.
Oh, God. Oh, dear. Too enthusiastic.
So with that slight anxiety taken away, your passage from Lear is going to introduce Juliet, who'll come to the same microphone after.
Can I just explain it a bit?
Please do.
You all know this passage. But this is the great turning point for Lear as a human being. He's naked on the heath with the storm raging around him, and meets a disguised Edgar as homeless and naked. Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have ta'en too little care of this. Take physic, pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them, and show the heavens more just.
Juliet, if you'd like to come to this one here. Juliet, tell us about why you're in the acting profession.
Oh, well, because that piece, this is honestly the truth, that piece that Simon's just so exquisitely read is what made me want to be an actor, actually, because when I was 15, I was in my school hall, and 5 actors in jeans came in and did a sort of cut-down version of King Lear in about an hour and a half, playing all the parts between the 5 of them, and I'd never seen Shakespeare play before, or read one. And so I came into that hall, thought this is going to be boring, sat down, and 2 hours later I left a completely different person, as my memory serves. And because of that speech, actually, well, because of the whole journey of King Lear, I wasn't interested in Cordelia or Goneril or Regan or any of the stupid, as I felt at the time, women in the play. Not stupid because, anyway, I just wanted to play King Lear. And I wanted to play King Lear because of the story, because it's a story of a man who goes from a sense of huge grievance and rage, and expression of that rage and entitlement, to an understanding, and then he learns the need and the power of compassion, and he understands what it is to feel what others feel, and then he feels hunger and cold and wet and loneliness and bleakness and abandonment, which is what most of the population experience, and then he realizes that all that seems in some way to contextualize his own sense of his own injustices, and he makes a connection to every other human, as Simon has just read, and that was like, it was a moment of such huge sort of soul opening. It politicized me, and it made me want to act at the same moment. Not an exaggeration. I became an actress because I think, not unconnected to that, I thought I want to pretend to be other people and tell their stories by finding out why it is that they say and do what they say and do. I want to understand why people do and say what they do. And I think I could do that. I can imagine what it's like to be almost anybody else, and that's very arrogant. And in so doing, I think that could change the world. And I honestly thought at 18, when I went to drama school, that we could change the world through what we did. I'm not sure anymore, but...
People often say you should never criticize your brother and sister till you've walked a mile in their moccasins. Mm. In a sense, that's exactly what the acting profession does. It walks in somebody else's shoes. So is there something inherently merciful about the stage?
I think there is. I mean, I was interested to hear Simon say that, you judge your characters. I mean, I would slightly argue with that. I mean, maybe I'm being less honest than he is. I would like to say that we don't judge them. I think what I feel is that you don't judge a character. Your job, which may be an extremely challenging job, is to understand them as profoundly as possible, to contextualize everything they say and do by understanding what are the forces that shape them, the forces in the world, the forces of their backgrounds, their families, the culture they're living in, all the things that shape us, and their DNA, their genetic makeup, and their relationships, all those things that shape us and who we are and our identities and how we behave, and behave well or badly, and love, hate. All those things, you just have to understand a character and then reveal that understanding to an audience. And in relation to each other, a relationship on stage is an exploration of how two people, or 3 or 10, influence and shape each other. And that, to me, is an act of huge compassion, because it's an act of revelation. What you're inviting an audience to do is say, don't judge for the moment. Look at Othello murdering his young wife. But by the time he does that, we hope you understand why he's driven to it. Not to excuse him in the act of murder, but for you to bring your compassion to bear on why, at that moment, it was all he could do. Now, if you were Desdemona's mother, you might feel differently. But the fact is that the fact that, for example, when you go and watch a performance of Othello, you see the whole story. You see the racism, you see what he's had to put up with, you see how he's dealt with, you see how grudgingly his status as a black general in a white army is held. You see the manipulation worked on him by Iago, his junior, his lieutenant, and so on. And then finally, you see him commit that appalling act of murder. But by the time you're watching him kill her, you understand all the forces that have driven him to it. So Othello emerges not as a villain in Shakespeare, but actually as something of a hero. Whereas Macbeth kills near the beginning, or he goes on killing, so he is less... Do you see what I mean? So I think it's a very problematic play, Othello, for all sorts of reasons, I think, but it has a hugely compassionate structure as a narrative, because the act is, first of all, given all its context. And I think that any play, that should be what we're doing. We should be saying, don't just watch it for the narrative or the plot, don't judge the characters too early. Recognize yourselves in these people, and let's all share in this space we're all in, a sense that we all could be any of these people you're watching, That's why I think it's political, small p, and that's why I think it can generate compassion, because it encourages understanding and discourages quick judgments. And we've never lived at a time where we needed that more, I think,
I often say to say to you, I want to be your friend, is to say I am allowing my life to be changed by knowing you. Can you tell us about a part that you've played that has changed you in that sense, that you've gained mercy for a character you may not initially have related to or found attractive? Or even a plot of a play that has done exactly what you've just described in terms of changing the actors as well as the audience?
Well, I suppose the obvious example is Death and the Maiden, a play I did by Ariel Dorfman, which was a very sort of extreme example of somebody who has been wronged herself. So, as quick a summary as possible. It's the Pinochet regime in Chile, military dictatorship, murdered and killed a whole generation of young people. Finally, that murderous regime was booted out. And Chile, when that regime was booted out and introduced progressive democracy, they decided to have an amnesty. So everybody involved in that terrible regime, that era of torture and killing and assassination of all political enemies and so on, was forgiven a bit like South Africa. They had a sort of truth and reconciliation situation. And I was interested in what Simon was saying, because the people who had then to do the forgiving were the people to whom the worst atrocities had taken place. So not only had they been through the worst atrocities, they'd lost their loved ones, they disappeared, they'd suffered torture, they'd been detained, imprisoned, bereaved, denied everything. But they were then the people who were asked to forgive. And I think for many people, the act of forgiveness appears to feel like you're giving something away. You are losing part of yourself if you forgive. Because to forgive is to let go of an anger or a rage or a grievance that makes you feel somehow lesser. I'm not saying that's the objective truth. I think for many people that is the challenge. In this play, Paulina, my character, had been tortured, imprisoned under Pinochet, and the play is set 17 years later when she's trying to get on with her life. There's a new government, it's a democracy, and she believes she comes across her torturer. She hears his voice, he's in the house, a colleague of her husband's, and she believes him to be the man who tortured her, who she never saw because they were blindfolded in the torture chamber. But she hears his voice, and that's who she thinks it is, and so she takes her own vengeance. And so the whole play is a debate about whether it's okay, whether it's justified for her to take this revenge or not. And in the end, all she's asking him to do is speak. She doesn't want to hurt him. She doesn't want to kill him or damage him in any way. She ties him up and she says, I will let you go once you have just told the story of what you did to me, but I need to hear it out. I never had that, and I need to hear it. I need to hear. And he says, well, I can't because it wasn't me. You never know whether it was him or not. So in the end, she has to tell her husband what was done to her all those years ago in that torture chamber. And then he tells the guy, and the guy has to make a confession, which he says is a false confession. But nevertheless, it's him speaking this experience that he says. And then she lets him go. And the final scene of the play is where they meet together a year later in a concert hall. And they come in and they take their seats, and the orchestra comes in, and they look down, they see each other. And she has to continue with her life, and she has to say, good evening, and then the orchestra starts to play, and there they are back in the world in a civilized relationship to each other. So that play was all about the question, really, of revenge as opposed to forgiveness. What it costs. I mean, what it costs people to have to give the world what the world requires. The world requires forgiveness and mercy and forbearance, but actually, who is paying the cost of that? And is that an entirely appropriate way to move forward, or is it more complicated than that, and so on? It was very interesting. It threw up a lot of questions.
So, can I ask you the same question I asked Simon then about the current political crisis and social crisis, perhaps more than political crisis? Is what's needed more than anything else, or is what has been missing in the last 3.5 years, is the ability of people with strong convictions on different sides to have mercy, to have insight, to have what drama perhaps alone can do, the ability to see into each other's stories. And like you described about Othello, you may think what he did to his wife was terrible, but the play gets you to the point where you would have done that if you'd been in his shoes. And is that what's been missing as much in society as in political discourse, the ability to realize that from where someone else is sitting, their views make complete sense?
Absolutely, Sam. I mean, I think you've said it. I'm like many of you here. I'm sure I feel close to despair about the state of the way things are developing, not only in our own country but in the world around us. And I see that people more and more are dividing themselves up into smaller and smaller tribes and groups, and this identity politics means that people are kind of only speaking from their tiny little group against all the other groups, and the whole social media frenzy whereby you leap to judgments. You leap instantly to judgments. Somebody uses a word, somebody puts something on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, and they're completely condemned by a whole lot of people who don't understand, who know nothing about the context, don't know the person, don't know the circumstances around why they put, it's all about instant opinion, instant judgment, and instant identification, and it's nothing to do. There is, the qualities that we've achieved in civilized life in the last 100 years, post-Freud, of understanding this human psychology, of why people are the way they are, this all seems to be disappearing. We should be capitalizing on those discoveries about the human psyche. And in fact, we're increasingly going back to some medieval frenzy whereby we make instant judgments. She's got a wart on her nose, she must be a witch, let's drown her in the village pond. There are people, there's this cancellation culture where people say one thing on Twitter and their whole careers or lives are destroyed within a few weeks. I mean, it is the culture of hatred. Hating seems to become a sort of hobby. I've come off Twitter myself recently because I could no longer bear that when I tweeted something about refugee event, I've got very involved in the refugee crisis, that I would just get this torrent of hatred. And, for a while I didn't mind. And in the end I thought, God, I can't stand this anymore because what's coming it bears no relation to what I've tweeted. It's class hatred, it's racial, it's about so many other things, but it's about a kind of warfare. And it does feel like we're living in a country which there's a sort of civil war going on now. People are they've chosen their side and they're sticking to it. And it doesn't matter if they don't have any information. We're all ignorant. None of us know what this deal is, but we're going to stick to our identities because that's our identity, and we're just going to fight it out. Nobody wants to listen. And I think the first act involved in any act of compassion or mercy is that you hear. You have, first of all, to sit and listen. You have to listen, and you have to just suspend your own need, whatever it is, and hear the reality of somebody else's point of view, and then hear further and hear more, and then try and find a point of connection to it, and then you can make your judgment. And I guess what theatre is, if I can hold on to optimism, is that's what it does. You sit in the dark for an hour or 2 or 3 hours. You listen, you watch, you understand, you get to know, you identify with, and then when you walk out 3 hours later, hopefully that has tempered you in some way, it has seasoned you in some way. So maybe we won't leap to judge people as quickly after the event. I don't know. I don't know. Sorry, that was very depressing. I'm very frightened at the moment because I think, where is the compassion? Where is the compassion going? Thousands of people have drowned in the Mediterranean now, the refugee community, and where is that? Do we not care about that? Are those lives worth less than any other life? Apparently they are. But, it's so shocking that countries are turning away boats of desperate people who will drown if they are turned away, and they're still turned away. I mean, how can we be doing that? How can Italian government be turning away boats? How is that possible? We look back at history and we say, lest we forget, but we forget immediately.
Thank you, Juliet. I'm going to ask Richard to step up for a few moments, give you a little break. And this feels a bit like Moral Maze, where they bring on a series of expert witnesses. Richard, as many of you will know, spent a number of years, 15 years, in the Solomon Islands, and a place that's kind of the victim of all the West's sins in many ways, particularly in terms of climate change and rising sea levels, but also a place that experienced civil war while Richard was there, and Richard was bringing together drama performances in that context. So, Richard, tell us a bit about, we've heard from Juliet about, particularly with the example of Dorfman and Death and the Maiden, that there's a sense of putting a story out there with an unresolvedness about it. How do you decide how to balance, giving a clear message, if you like, vis-a-vis leaving an open-ended conclusion that allows people to draw their own thoughts?
Well, I think this is the power of drama, because it has the ability to tell a story that if you tried to preach that story, people would react against. They'd think you were judging them or condemning them or pointing a finger at them. But when you present a drama, just as Jesus presented dramas in his parables, you're just actually opening up the story for them to own it for themselves, to discover it. And in Solomon Islands, in this time of conflict where it was very tribal, two different island groups were fighting against each other, and the members of our own community had been murdered. So it was tough stuff. But drama became the one means where we could present a story which, in a way, went round the barriers, which navigated the prejudices and made people listen to the voice of the other. So, for example, these are simple things, but we performed the story of the prodigal son, or we performed the story of the Good Samaritan. And in the Good Samaritan became the enemy tribe. So when the Good Samaritan came towards the man who was of their own village, who had been beaten up by their own militant groups because he'd betrayed them, the person who came to save that beaten up man by the road was speaking the tribal language of their enemy. And suddenly the whole village was hushed. You could have heard a pin drop. And people with automatic machine guns standing around were watching their enemy becoming the hero of the story. And I remember we were performing this in one village one night, and a village woman just got up and started shouting at the militants, "That's what you're doing! That's what you're doing to our country! Throw those guns away! Throw those guns away!" And she'd entered into the story because the drama had taken over the argument, and she'd seen truth. And I think when drama is good, that's what happens. We break through the prejudice and we see truth, and we want to own that truth for ourselves. There's a beautiful story of I came with this group of Solomon Islanders over to this country, and we performed in schools all around Liverpool and Chester. And we were performing in a school in Liverpool, and we got all the kids to join in with the story of the prodigal son. And we had the prodigal son as a refugee who'd come over to seek his fortune, left everything behind, and here he was in Liverpool, penniless, lost everything. He was eating somebody else's leftover takeaways. He was homeless. Everything had gone wrong. And I said to the school kids, "Okay, you're the crowd in Liverpool. Walk past this refugee, this bit of dirt who's just eating from the garbage on the street floor." And all the kids got into it and started walking past, throwing things at him, throwing Coke cans and getting into the kind of bullying sort of, "Oh, this is just a useless person." And there was one kid, a 12-year-old, who just said, "I'm not going to do that." I said, "What?" "I don't want to do that." I said, "Well, you've got to. That's the story. That's the story of the prodigal son. Everyone walks past." He said, "I don't want to do that." I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" "I want to talk to him." Well, I said, "Well, go on then, talk to him." And this one little kid in front of all his friends knelt down with a refugee from Solomon Islands and said, "Look, mate, if you're hungry, you can come to my house. My mum will cook you some tea." And there he was, standing up against the whole, group culture, the whole gang culture, had the courage of the drama to challenge the bullying and the way this refugee was being treated. And he became a great friend of the community of brothers and went round with us and wanted to attend all their performances. It was drama changing someone. And as he changed the drama, so we were changed by him. And I think that's what good drama can do.
And tell us about how you've experienced that here at St Martin's.
Well, the passion play, a passion story is the story of mercy, really, beyond all others. It's the story of the mercy of Christ on a cross. And each year at this church we present a passion play, but I've tried each year to choose someone very different to play the part of Christ and to play the disciples. So often the disciples have become the people who have, in usual terms in our society, been the excluded ones. People who are homeless or refugees have become the centre of that passion play. And one year, well, even this year, we had a man called Capano playing Jesus. He's from a country in Africa where he was tortured because of his sexuality, brutally tortured. And during the rehearsals, I thought he wasn't going to make it to play the part of Jesus. He kept on not turning up, and I said, look, I can't do a passion play if Jesus doesn't turn up. And he kept on saying, no, I'll do it, I just need time. And then he came, and as he played it, he began to, you could see him growing in confidence, and it was just beautiful to see. He began to really inhabit the part. And on the day he played it, and I think people who were here who saw it, he was crucified up there in front of the window, and he cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forgotten me? And it was like you realized that the cry was not just Jesus' cry, it was his own cry, that he had been through that torture himself, and we were silenced by it. And suddenly the whole of the crucifixion began to make sense in a new way. We began to see what it was like to be tortured, and the torturers in our production wore dark glasses, and they waterboarded our Jesus. And we began to realize that this torture is still taking place. And when Capano cried out from the cross, I said to him afterwards, that was beautiful, that was so beautiful. And he just said, without any kind of embarrassment, he said, I want to be beautiful because they must want to eat my body. And I thought he was joking. He said, that's what we say. That's what you say in your church. This is my body given to you. And I suddenly realized that he had been through that, and there are still people going through that, showing that mercy, and it transformed us. I've also had someone playing Jesus, Fiona, she's here tonight. She played Jesus in a wheelchair. And when the guards and the people overturn the wheelchair, there she is, someone who needs to use a wheelchair. And there she was without a wheelchair. And it just suddenly, you realize the bullying nature of culture, the violence, the brutality that still goes on. And somehow we all grew in humanity and the desire to move beyond that viciousness and to discover a greater mercy.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to come over here, and Juliet and Simon to take their respective microphones, which means I haven't got a stand, so I'm going to wander around aimlessly. I want to ask you about something that has bothered me for 20 years nearly, and that is at 9/11, America was the wounded animal and was portrayed as the Christian country that was being attacked by, a rival view of the world. And on the 12th of September 2001, George W. Bush had the opportunity, not as the powerful person in the world, but for the first time in possibly ever, America with the sympathy of the world as the wounded one, had the chance to exercise mercy and chose to come out all guns blazing, and we know the story since then. I wonder, from your respective experiences of drama, which character in that story comes to your mind in the story of the 12th of September 2001? Where I'm asking because I feel that was like the fall in the post-war era. That was the one chance the West had to show the world the Christianity that this was all about, and it came out as if it was in a Western, and it was John Wayne I wonder if you could talk about the pathos of that moment as you perceive it from your different, from a directing perspective, from people who've played lead parts many, many times, Shakespeare, wherever you want to take it. I'm just fascinated in that as a moment where mercy failed or was ignored. Who wants to start?
I'm really trying to puzzle this through, so give me a minute. I don't know. I don't know whether it's an equivalent I can think of in my life that makes sense of any of that. I mean, I really don't.
How could it have been done differently? If we imagine it as a drama rather than as history, how could 12th of September have shown mercy rather than judgment?
I don't know. I really am genuinely at a loss. I don't know. And I don't know that my work and the writing I've had the luck to present would help. I'm just trying to think. I'm trying to think through the parts that I've played, and I don't know.
Or tell us about the don't know, the power of the don't know there. Are you expressing, and I don't want to sound grand here, but are you expressing the fact that our culture, Western culture, can't get to that place? That actually what W was enacting was where the West, where it has got to as a culture. It didn't have public words of mercy.
Yeah, that's probably it. I mean, I don't.
And yet Mandela only 6 years before had said to Francois Pienaar, "Thank you for what you've done for our country," and Pienaar replied, "Thank you for what you've done for our country in South Africa." So that is in the global culture. It is possible to express mercy, and yet if there was one moment of failure, surely that was it. How could we have done differently?
I think that those of us who will vividly remember that moment, I think I felt as though I was watching some drama being played out, and I think it seemed so palpably clear, didn't it, on the day after 11th of September, that the absolutely catastrophic thing to do would be to translate that into an act of warfare and revenge without taking a moment to understand why such a brutal attack might have taken place in the first place. To ask the question is what I was saying earlier. Why? Why have this group of people chosen to commit this atrocious, murderous act on a bunch of innocent Americans on a weekday morning? Why? If you don't ask why, then you will, and of course, Bush was incapable of asking why. Now, was he incapable as a human being, or was he incapable because he saw his role as some sort of, in some sort of movie, some Schwarzenegger-type role whereby he was going... I mean, I ask that question because those movies are really, really insidious, I think. Because they encourage the idea that there are such concepts as evil and good, and I question those things. If you decide that there is evil in the world, then you stop asking questions. And to say that, that act was an evil act, it was a terrible, terrible act, but it didn't come out of nothing. It came out of a whole history. It came out of a hugely complicated sense that the Americans have colonized and abused the world in all sorts of ways, and in ways which they refuse to acknowledge. And in the face of that constant and long-term refusal to acknowledge or even to understand their actions in the world, then somebody ends up smashing 2 planes into their tallest building. But it was a terrible, terrible act. But without bringing any understanding to bear on it, it was always going to be a catastrophe. And I think many of us will remember that moment and sitting back and hearing Bush say, war on terror, those 3 words I'll never forget. And I turned to my husband and said, that is going to be a catastrophe. We're now going to watch a catastrophe unfold and then another one and another one. And we still are. We still are watching that catastrophe that unfolded from the 12th of September, aren't we?
So in a sense, what you're describing it very vividly is an archetype which is kind of lodged in the in our brain or in our imaginations, and we as a culture, most obviously expressed by President George W. Bush at the time, saw those events through the paradigm, through the matrix of that archetype. The story was already there in our minds. Can you talk about the power of those sort of archetypes in the dramas particularly? I mean, you've talked about Shakespearean, both of you already, but the ways in which perhaps the contemporary dramas that you've been involved with, even quite recently, I know, are challenging some of those archetypes, are creating space for mercy by enabling us to step out of a given story in which we're all bit part players.
It seems to me that there are many stories that are simply not being heard when we enter into this sort of binary confrontation. And there are moments of breakthrough, like there was that one moment of breakthrough when that child was washed up on the beach, and suddenly all the Daily Mail, who'd been ridiculing the migrant crisis, suddenly for a few weeks saw a different side. Suddenly there was something more merciful in the reporting because that picture was so profoundly shocking. And I think that in great drama there is an ability to change the story. And I've witnessed drama changing a story.
And I think that picture of the little boy, the 2-year-old Elan Kurdi, that's an interesting example. You're quite right. So, for months and months, people have been told that, hundreds, thousands of people are drowning, women, children, babies. It hadn't really penetrated. And then somebody publishes a photograph of a tiny 2-year-old dead on a beach. But it isn't that if he'd been wearing a jalaba, but he was wearing little jogging pants and tiny little trainers and a sweatshirt. And his head was buried in the beach, in the sand. And I think that people looked at that picture and thought, but that looks like Alfie or Jack or my grandson, my neighbor. Wasn't it recognition? They should have been able to feel, we should all be able to feel compassion when we read newsprint, but we somehow can't. But when you see, it was unbearably recognizable. It looked like your grandson asleep on the couch, but he was dead, And I think that recognition is the key word, because I think if we can recognize each other, that is it. Then then we can imagine. And imagination is our most political tool. It's the most powerful political tool we have, is the imagination. Einstein, didn't he say, Albert Einstein said, imagination is so much more powerful than knowledge. Knowledge is limited, but the imagination is limitless. And with the imagination, the power to, what would it be like to be them? What if that little boy were my grandson or my son or my neighbor's little boy? What if I was on a boat with my baby and it got stormy and the boat ran out of petrol and there was a smug? What if? And we only have to ask what if to find compassion. Shakespeare, interesting, the word if is fascinating in Shakespeare. Simon will know more about this than me, but it's a word he uses thousands of times, isn't it?
Imagination.
If. And if is a word which says what if, if, and whatever follows is a door opening into the imagination. Let's imagine, what if we were dressed up as pretended to be men? Or, he's always exploring what if, because he's always encouraging you to say, let's imagine a situation. And so I think that if drama encourages imagining and trying to imagine what it's like to be someone else, then that is an act of huge compassion. If we practice that more, if we read that article in the Evening Standard on the way home where we thought, oh, so this, instead of judging the person you're reading about in this article, you think, well, I wonder why they did that. What drove that woman to kill her husband? What drove that young boy to stab his friend? What are the forces at work that make it, nobody wants to do those things. So what are the forces at work? And what if I were in that situation? Then we would have a different way of responding.
That's what drama can do. It can open up the story. There's a refugee who's part of our refugee group, who everyone in this congregation knows his name, and he was suddenly picked off the street and put in detention centre, and suddenly everyone in the congregation was upset about what was happening in the detention centre because they knew that person and they loved him. And suddenly the whole refugee detention centre took on a new meaning because we knew the story of this man who'd been so unfairly put there. And I wanted to say, yeah, but we didn't care about it last week, and there are 200 people in that place, and all of them are as important as the person we love and know. And no one is listening to their story.
I'm going to turn to Simon just in a second, and I'm coming right to you. I'm just going to give you a 3-minute warning. I'm going to come to all you guys pretty soon, okay? So start thinking about what you'd like to ask Simon.
I just want to say something about I don't know, because I went into a panic then. And I don't know about a lot of the things that as an actor I'm asked about. And I don't say that with any pride. I say it with a great deal of fear. When the referendum came around to leave the EU, I felt unqualified. And I just want to say that's why I went into a panic about I don't know. And part of the reason why I find my job so fascinating is that every single project probably introduces me to an area of experience that I didn't know about until I started doing the play. However widely I read, however widely I read the newspapers and watch the news and read around, I'll suddenly come across a subject which I didn't know about before. And it was a bit like watching the Chernobyl brilliant TV series about Chernobyl, which introduced me to a whole series of things I didn't know about, and I lived through it, and I knew the vague outline, but I hadn't realised what the consequence of it was. And I just wanted to say that's drama at its best, really, and that's where it can. Well, drama is best of a particular type, but it's drama at its best, which is what Richard's saying, Juliet's saying, that it opens up the world to people who don't know. And seeing Juliet's play at the Maiden, which she's just finished doing, I didn't know. So I'm just admitting that. And I don't say it with any pride, as that's why I wanted to.
Well, I think you should say it with pride, because I think not knowing is a very wonderful place to be. Because in saying you don't know, it's an acknowledgement that you have to start finding out and listening and hearing. And if we were all able to say, I don't know, the world would be a hugely much better place.
And it is a part of the delight of our job, isn't it?
And I long for a politician to say, I don't know. I ache for them to do that.
It's going to be a while, I think. So one more from me, and then I'm going to look for some hands going up around the place. Is it fair to say that the climate change debate, which is gaining force, gaining momentum, is in significant ways about mercy, that have mercy on the earth, have mercy on future generations? Is mercy actually the heart of the climate change conversation? And how could that be portrayed on the stage?
Well, it's got to be. It's just got to be. There isn't a bigger question. But if you want to know, there have been, for the last 20 years, I've been at workshops developing projects which have ended up in a slightly different form about this. There isn't a bigger subject. So we don't have an option in theatre or film or TV except to address the issue. Whether it's about mercy to the earth, I don't know. Actually, it's mercy to ourselves, I think, probably, apart from anything. It's a question of self-preservation, but it's also about the beautiful gift that we've been given and respect for that. But no, there isn't a more important question. It's as simple as that. So
help us think about, from all of your experience of turning imagination into drama, how does that work then? How does a playwright then take a kind of microcosm of a situation, perhaps in Solomon's or a place like that it's at the sharp end of these issues, how does it do that? You talked about Alan Kurdi on that beach. and how that image captured the imagination even of the Daily Mail. How does it work in terms of drama? How do you transfer passion and conviction about a huge range of different issues, science and all sorts of social hierarchy and class issues? How does that turn into drama?
Can I answer? I'm doing two questions in a row, but I'll tell you about this is about, Juliet probably knows about this, but it's about 7 years ago. Katie Mitchell, the great director, asked a couple of us to do a sort of workshop on climate change. And we spent about 3 days in developing theatrical ideas, ideas that would work in the theatre. In the end, interesting enough, it ended up as a lecture. And it was done upstairs at the Royal Court. Some of you might have seen it, and I can't remember the title. It was called something like 10 billion, 8 billion. Anyway, the interesting thing about that from a theatrical point of view is that actually there wasn't anything more interesting or more frightening or more scary or more theatrical than a man standing there who knew what he was talking about. Get back to the I don't know subject. A man who was standing there, know what he was talking about and telling us the truth. It's quite a lesson for a theatre practitioner to realise that actually the sheer power of the information was the most theatrical thing about that, not the way it was being presented.
Well, that's really interesting because I don't know. I think in that instance it might have been, but years ago I got very worked up about child detention. Until not recently we were locking up children in the asylum system. Bunging them into Yarlswood Detention Centre. No education, no outdoor space, no rights, no lawyers, no privileges. Kids. Anyway, got very worked up about this. Went to Yarlswood, met these two families with children the same age as my children at the time. That was what struck me. So I'd fed my children that morning and got them off to school, and one of my kids was then a 13-year-old girl who'd gone off to her school, play with her kids, do her classes, have a wonderful day. And there were two 13-year-old girls, one Azerbaijani and one Turkish Kurd girls, same age as my daughter, in detention with their mums. And their mums were in a state of psychological collapse. And they were trying to parent their own mums and their younger siblings who were all, bedwetting. It was a disastrous state. Got onto the train at the end of that day and I said, okay, we have to tell these stories. I don't believe the people in this country would want us to be doing this if they knew. So anyway, cut a long story short, we got to know those families. We started they told us our stories, and the children and the mothers, and we got all this recorded and we wrote it down as transcripts, exactly what they'd all said. They described their experiences of living happily in Wales and then being picked up by the asylum forces and put them in et cetera, and being deported and being brought back. And we knitted all these narratives into a theatre piece, and we did it at the Young Vic on a Sunday. And I said to Natasha Walton, my friend who works in this sector, I don't want people here, Guardian, let's have in this audience, the Daily Mail editor, the Sun, the Evening Standard, let's have people who are not converted. We don't need, obviously, to tell these stories. So we filled it as much as possible. We invited people in, and we had other refugees, I had my daughter and two of her friends, white, privileged, middle-class girls, reading the roles of these other children. And people said, shouldn't you be getting, young kids of colour to read these? Isn't this a bit? And I said, no, I really, really want the audience to hear what these children are suffering and experiencing coming out of the mouths of white, middle-class, privileged children. And so we did, and the mothers also had their experiences told by actors. And the power of those stories, simply the words of those own people telling their stories in their own words through actors, and the power of seeing three kids, white kids, standing there saying, I can't open the window in my room, I can only put my hand through, that's how we, And at the end, I stood by the door and people were going out, and they were lots of people got engaged with the campaign, found lawyers, gave money, picked it up. Michael Morpurga wrote a book about it. This is everything to do with the power of feeling, because people weren't given information in that room. They felt it. They felt what it was to be a kid whipped out of her house in Cardiff and out of her school and away from her friends and put in a room in a detention centre with no lawyers and a mother collapsing. They felt what it was like. And because they felt it, They were moved to get involved, and they suspended what they'd always thought about, you know. And I do think that that is the power of what drama can do.
I agree.
It just is, that you can read all the newsprint in the world, you can be fed all the data in the world, but if you don't feel it and identify, then you won't be moved to respond and act.
Can I just join that thing about children? Because I think the whole climate change debate, we were finding it here, that it was running out of energy because we were really fighting, you know, against, everyone was fighting, you know, the climate change issue, but it seemed like we weren't getting anywhere and no one was listening. And then suddenly, in the last few months, the drama is that children have taken over, and suddenly it's got this energy and this life, and you can see them, you know, bunking off school and coming into London. I was really, really thrilled with this, because suddenly the whole climate change drama has taken off again in a new way. I found very exciting.